market in Mogadishu.
NATO's military success against
many Western nations.
This is On Assignment. Hello everyone, we're glad to have you again with us. I'm Imran Tadiki.
And I'm Alex Villarreal. Coming up, the dramatic reopening of US-Cuba relations, how Cuban Americans are responding.
Ebola, is the worst of it over? We talked with our correspondent in West Africa.
Then staying in Africa with a look at why air flight between countries is not as easy as you might think it should be.
And young people capturing life in South Sudan through the lens of their cameras.
Stay with us. On Assignment starts right now.
It's been less than 2 months since President Barack Obama announced the U.S. would begin to normalize relations with Cuba, and things are already opening up in what some have dubbed the Cuban Thaw.
Right, the move eases more than 50 years of tensions between the two nations. For more on how it's been received, we turn to Patricia Dalmasi, host of Foro Interamericano for the VOA Spanish branch. Talking about the opening up of U.S.-Cuba relations. In the past, we've seen Cuban Americans very divided on U.S.-Cuba policy. Has it been the same this time?
I don't think it's the same. I mean, we see surveys, maybe the latest one like 3 months ago, and by and large, the Americans support the measures taken by the president, and the Cuban Americans, let's say in Miami, in Little Havana, is divided. But more and more you see changes towards supporting the president.
And what's at the root of those divisions?
You can see people from the old school, still from the Cold War era, that are not happy that the Castros are going to get money from these easing of sanctions right now, and there is some evidence to that. You know, they will be making millions of dollars through tourism and through goods, the exchange of goods.
What about within Cuba? How are people feeling?
In Cuba, it's mixed as well. You can see dissidents, opposition leaders that did not want to meet with Roberta Jacobson because they said that they're not being represented in the talks. However, State Department as well as the Cuban government have been saying that this is a start. They need to start this way. It's more official talks, and the dissidents are not part of neither government.
You host a program, Foro Interamericano, and you focus on analyzing all these issues that come up that affect Latin America. So what have analysts told you about this?
Basically what they're saying is we have to wait and see what's going to happen, what really concrete steps is the Cuban government going to take. They've been at this situation in the past, sort of, not as drastic as they are now, but they need to wait and see to really see that the government is actually improving.
What about Congress? You know, that is something that we've all been watching, the way that lawmakers have reacted to this, because there have been some divisions there as well.
Well, in Congress, all the Cuban American, congressmen and congresswomen with Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, either Democrat or Republican, the fact that they have ties to Cuba put them against, or they've been critical of the Obama administration. Basically, the main source is human rights abuses by the Cuban government. We saw in December, this was announced in December 17th. Well, the whole month of December, there was a lot of repression from the government, and they put a lot of dissidents in jail. They have the 53 dissidents, supposedly, they were freed, but some studies, some organizations have put that number in over 8,000 political prisoners.
So one of the big central issues here that a lot of people are focusing on is the embargo. Do you think we're going to see it lifted anytime soon?
I think it's going to be very hard to lift the embargo because it is by the law, Helms-Burton law. The president cannot actually lift it. So he's done as much as he can within the executive powers. So it has to be Congress. And right now, with the Republicans, domineering both houses, and the Cuban Americans really being active in Congress, to not let that happen, I see it that it's going to be very difficult.
It's going to be tough, yeah. Now, finally, as a journalist, you've been covering Latin American issues for years. What was your reaction when you heard this announcement from President Obama, and what was the buzz in your newsroom?
Well, it was a surprise. It was shocking, but at the same time, since we cover Latin American news, we saw that President Barack Obama had made that promise. He didn't say what, but he said that he wanted in 2008 some change to the U.S. policy towards Cuba. So it was, yes, a surprise the time it came, but also somehow expected.
And what is also expected is this transition is not going to be smooth sailing the whole time. As Patricia mentioned, deep disagreements remain in the area of human rights, and Cuban President Raul Castro is demanding the U.S. turn over its Guantanamo military base before relations can be restored, and this is something the U.S. says is not happening.
It's not happening.
Right.
I understand that. We're taking a break now, but coming up, commercial air travel in Africa. Why it's harder to fly than it probably should be. You're watching On Assignment. If you have traveled often in Africa, you might have wondered why it's easier and often far cheaper to fly from one African city to another by going through Europe. For nearly 30 years, African Union officials have tried and failed to implement an agreement to make the entire continent one connected, free airspace for civilian aircraft. Proponents say that enacting this treaty would boost African airlines and much needed transportation options. And one man has even written a book about it. And joining me now via Skype from Johannesburg is VOA's Anita Powell. Anita, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Imran. Thanks.
Hey, tell us a bit about this. This treaty has been, they've been talking about this since a long time, and I don't seem to understand what is the issue here. Why don't they want this treaty implemented?
Well, let me go ahead and try to explain this 264-page book in about 15 seconds. In 1988, African nations agreed, 44 of them agreed to implement this liberalization policy, which would make air traffic cheaper. What happened in ensuing years, fast forward to about 2000, it became legally binding. Many countries just flatly ignored it. And there's several reasons, according to the very well-versed, knowledgeable source I spoke to, Charles Schlumberger of the World Bank. One is lack of political will. Another is airspace landing fees, at airports are cash cows. They bring much needed revenue into African countries, and airports are just very profitable enterprises. Who would want to let go of that? And another reason is many African countries are trying to protect their rather fragile national carriers. And so opening up the airspace would allow the big boys, and I'm talking about African big boys, Ethiopia, maybe Kenyan Airlines, SAA out of South Africa, to come in and basically run over the competition.
Is there also a concern that once they do this, it kind of opens the doors of potential terrorism?
I want to be really clear about the Yamoussoukro Declaration and decision. They apply to civilian airspace only. Military airspace is a whole different kettle of fish. Those are different agreements, and those are governed in very different ways, and of course subject to those sorts of things. Is this going to, for example, open up the possibility of another, Nigerian underpants bomber? Mm-hmm. Maybe. If you have more flights flying over that certain airspace, are more people going to try to target them? Possibly. But that's not as a consequence of this decision. Liberalization of airspace is not going to necessarily open the door for terrorism.
What about the matters being taken up by the African Union this year? Do you think something will come out of that?
Right. So the AU actually, in its summit, they did actually agree to move further with the Yamoussoukro Declaration. Remains to be seen whether this is going to have any effect. I mean, they haven't already. It's been enforced since about 2000, and nothing has happened. I don't really know what teeth they have, but let's see.
Well, we'll keep an eye on that. Anita Powell with VOA in Johannesburg. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We're taking a break now. Still to come, the easing of Ebola in West Africa. You're watching On Assignment.
It began quietly in Guinea in the last days of 2013, but the Ebola virus quickly spread, becoming one of the world's biggest health concerns of last year.
Thousands of people lost their lives to the disease, but now the epidemic is slowing, with dramatically fewer cases cropping up in Guinea and the other two worst affected countries, Liberia and Sierra Leone.
All this progress is encouraging, but is the threat really over? West Africa correspondent Ann Look tells us what she's been seeing and hearing.
We're talking about some of the lowest numbers we've seen since June. June was when Ebola really surged outside of Guinea and kind of overtook Sierra Leone and Liberia. But now, I mean, we're reporting the fewest cases we've seen since June. Liberia is reporting, only 5 new cases of Ebola. So it's really promising. People are starting to really talk about turning the corner, turning the tide.
And how has this happened? What efforts have been working?
It's just been a combination of what they've been trying to do all along, isolating patients, educating communities, tracing contacts, safe burials. The problem was just the sheer volume of cases they were confronted with. The response was slow to ramp up and slow to keep pace with the outbreak over the summer. And so by the time we got to August, September, it had just exploded and everyone was running to catch up. They've now, it appears, caught up. In Sierra Leone, in Liberia, there are ETUs that are closing wards, that are reducing the numbers of beds, that have empty beds. It's just been that combo of things. But keep in mind, over the past month or two, it still has kind of surged back up in little pockets. For example, in Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone, back in November, December, we were seeing a worrying trend of increasing cases and some community resistance. And it didn't really, everyone was saying, how did this happen? Why is this part of the country behind everyone else? And so the government launched they called it the surge, to increase the number of ambulances, train burial workers, open more ETUs, surge the response in that area. And it has yielded results.
And Anne, you mentioned these little pockets of flare-ups. How should people be approaching this threat now? What do they need to be doing to still make sure that they are paying attention and keeping themselves safe?
Yeah, I think the countries, especially Liberia and Sierra Leone, people have gotten pretty used to not shaking hands and no hugging and no contact. I think the big concern now, when I talk to people in the region, in the countries that are dealing with this, is the regional interconnectedness of all of this, that these countries share big borders with lots of traffic across them. So, Liberia, no matter what they do in their neck of the woods, they can't really be Ebola-free until Sierra Leone is Ebola-free, until Guinea's Ebola-free. So there's a worry that the countries kind of need to all continue on this progress together. Otherwise, we could see another flare-up.
Right, and you have the unique opportunity of being in the region where we saw most of the cases. So what are people there now saying? I mean, are they feeling better about this?
Yeah, I mean, it does feel, in a sense, like the storm has passed a little bit, especially to be seeing these encouraging numbers coming out of places like Liberia. I mean, we recently filed a story on schools reopening, which was just such a big deal if you think about it. Schools had been out since the summer because, authorities were so afraid of children coming into so much contact with each other that they would be, kind of dens of contagion. And the fact that these countries are all reopening their schools, it speaks to this level of normalcy. I mean, I worked with our VOA Liberian colleague on a story in December about the reopening of a small health clinic outside of Monrovia, which just, the normalcy of it was remarkable. It was amazing because you keep in mind back in August, health workers went on strike. The clinics and the hospitals were too dangerous. Everything shut down. People weren't able to get vaccinations and treatments for things like malaria. So to even just see these little things kind of returning, little bits of normal life returning, it's encouraging.
Encouraging is right, but especially for those in the region, it is still important that you stay vigilant and informed. Doctors Without Borders says the end of the Ebola outbreak is not here yet.
Moving on to our next story. Last September, 20 young adults from across South Sudan took part in a National Geographic photo camp. They are among hundreds of students from around the world who have learned how to use a camera to tell the stories of their people.
VOA's Julie Tabo talked with 3 of the camp participants recently when they visited National Geographic headquarters in Washington. Here's a look at her report and what she told On Assignment's Lisa Vora about the experience.
The images have captured single moments in time of family bonds and friendship, work and community, love and survival. They were taken by young photographers who participated in special photo camps set up by National Geographic in communities around the world. This program is unique because Kirsten, who is in the segment, decided around 2003 that, why not give training and put cameras in the hands of youth, usually in underprivileged communities, to go out and document their own communities, the people in their communities, tell their stories through photographs.
Joining the photo camp meant a lot to me because it gave me a sense of thinking about photo in a very different way. The news gives a small perspective of the wide picture of what South Sudan is. Humanizing the life in South Sudan is what my heart wants to do, and through my camera I can easily do that.
These photographs are beautiful. I mean, I can't believe that young adults actually shot these photos. Tell me about Catherine and what inspires her and how she gets these amazing pictures, especially the one of the kid crying.
Well, one of the reasons these pictures were so successful and were so well received by everyone was because it really focused on the people in these communities that these young adults are from. And so she found this one little boy crying, and she was intrigued by that, and she started photographing him. And you would think, okay, it's an orphanage, there are going to be a lot of sad kids, and he was crying. But it turns out he was crying over a toy that he wanted that he couldn't have. Just like any other young boy who maybe would cry over a toy that's broken or a toy that he hasn't had.
All the kids have their own story to tell. The second one that you interviewed, he took a picture of a kickboxer with shorts on with both the flag of South Sudan and the flag of the United States. Could you tell me a little bit more about the story behind that?
Sure. And so Doku, who was one of the participants in the South Sudan camp, who was in Washington, was intrigued by that. And he came to find out later that it was because he and the others believed so much that the United States was a huge supporter of independence for South Sudan, which is the newest country. It's only 3 years old. And gained its independence in 2011. And he said it was very symbolic. Doku says documenting the kickboxers was also a way to show local youth that there are alternatives to a life of violence.
Our young boys, these days have joined conflict, they have joined military wings, to join military to fight their own brothers. And it's important to bring them together in peace and harmony. They fight for peace.
One common theme definitely has been there's just more to South Sudan than just war. And these kids really took it upon themselves to show it to the world through these pictures. The last kid, he was a refugee camp survivor, so it's very emotional for him. Very emotional,
and I think and there must have been some reasoning as to who got assigned what, but it just happened to be that Akwat is was a refugee himself in Kenya for many years. And so when he went into this refugee camp, he could really identify with the subjects that he was photographing.
I grew up as a refugee in a refugee camp, northern Kenya. And when I went there, it reflects back to how I was, and my soul was with them.
And he did a series of amazing photographs of young people, old people, and what struck him, he said that even though it was a refugee camp and he would expect to find a lot of despair, he went down to a local watering hole, actually the River Nile, and said that he found these 3 girls swimming, and they were happy and laughing and splashing each other, and he said, I wanted to capture that photograph because they, to me, were the symbol of hope. If you were just to look at these, you'd think, well, these are National Geographic photographers. They're beautifully composed, whether it was a refugee camp, whether it was a soccer tournament, a kickboxing tournament, just document it. And I think that's one of the reasons the program's been so successful and so inspiring.
It is very important to show a picture and tell a story about it.
And And staying on the subject of Sudan, in the mid-1980s, thousands of Sudanese boys escaped the country's civil war by walking for weeks, then months, and finally for over a year, up to 1,500 kilometers across 3 countries. They became known as the Lost Boys of Sudan.
Now, a very different life for one of the so-called Lost Boys, currently a chess master who teaches the game to children in the New York area. VOA's Bernard Schussman has this remarkable story.
It's very important to control the center of the board.
His name is Major Jawach. He has made the leap from being a refugee in Africa to a master chess champion in the United States. His job is to share his expertise with students in public and private schools, chess camps, and other events. During Sudan's civil war, Jawach, a Dinka tribe member, was forced out of the country with 20,000 other so-called lost boys. He fled to Ethiopia, then to Kenya, where he was in a refugee camp for 8 years. It was in Kenya that he learned to play chess. Jawach describes a dangerous journey in which half the boys did not survive. To eat, they had to kill wild animals.
There was animals while we were walking, and it was about 1,000-mile walk. And there was sometimes there's no water. And in the case when we were in Ethiopia, we have to go back and then cross the river. And in that river, a lot actually drowned. People who didn't know how to swim.
Jawach arrived in the United States in 2004 and began working as a security guard. Winning a chess tournament gave him this teaching opportunity. Jawach believes chess helps prepare young people for life.
Some kids are not interesting, so it's your job to make them like the game, to explain to them what is the chess gonna help them with. Like I can tell you, this game will give you patience and help your calculation, so it will improve your math skill.
Jawach enjoys the freedom he has in the United States as much or more than his love for chess, but his passion is playing and teaching chess to youngsters. His boss, Michael Proper, says Jawach has one great advantage.
I think he's believable. I think that they look at him and he's so unassuming that they feel like they can do what he's doing, and that it's plausible to them that as great as he is, and as humble as he is, that perhaps they can be too. And that's a great advantage for a coach to have, to be able to come in. That's a gift.
Jawach still has a big goal ahead of him, becoming an international chess master. With his proficiency and patience, Proper and his peers have no doubt that will happen. Bernard Chessman, VOA News, Queens, New York.
I know most of you already know it, but let's just start from, for those who don't know.
All right, it's official. We have got to start playing chess ourselves.
Seriously, you don't play it?
You know, I have played it at various times. I've learned the game, but I couldn't sit down with you right now with a chessboard and play. I would be horrible. I'd have to,
I can
I'd
teach
have to
you.
cheat on Google or
I can
something.
teach you. It's amazing. I think it builds your analytical skills. You know, one has to learn how to play chess.
It really does, and that's a really big point of the story we just saw from Bernard Schussman, is that chess equates to life.
Yep, and we got to play one day.
Yes, we
live,
will.
Live on
right
the show.
here, exactly.
On the show. Yeah. We're going to do that. But with that, it's time for us to go. But be sure to check us out online anytime at voanews.com under the Programs tab and look for our homepage.
Yeah, thank you so much for watching, everybody. On behalf of all of us here at On Assignment, goodbye from Washington.